Dr. Amy Johnson, what an honor to have you in the studio with me today. I'm really excited about our discussion. You're in my wheelhouse. When you talk about the mind and the unconscious mind and neuroplasticity and the spiritual neuroscience connection, this is what I've been researching for 38 years. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it too. I love, finding people that have that intersection. So this is going to be great.
I know, and getting into those deep things and just into the things like wisdom and the unconscious world. And it's just great. It's just wonderful. I love it. So first of all, before we start, just tell us a little bit about who you are and what motivates you and something that's not in your bio.
Yeah, so I'm from Michigan in the Midwest. I grew up fascinated with psychology from the time I was really, really little, always writing stories about how people thought and where their inner worlds came from. And as is true, I think for a lot of people, that's still what I do.
Yeah.
So I can look back to what I was doing at 4 and 5 and 6.
Love it.
That's what I do now, which is
That's
pretty cool.
amazing. Oh, I love that. So it's always been a passion of yours to be fascinated with the mind. And you also understand the concept of thought very well. I noticed that with your work. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time in my work doing clinical trials for the last 38 years. And I've always found people battle to understand what it is. And you really got into that. So before we dive in deeper, just tell us how you see thought and how important that is in terms of habits and breaking habits and so on.
Yeah. So to me, I think of thought as our ability to have experience.
Love it.
It's like everything. I mean, it's super, I know you get it, but for most people, thought, is dialogue, or it's cognitive only, or it's those little sentences.
Or it's memory.
Yes. So it's cognitive, but it's also bigger. It's conscious, but it's way bigger than conscious. I think it's all experience comes via this power of what I would call thought.
Love it. I absolutely love that definition. Thoughts are real and they're deep and they've got so many elements to them. So fantastic. Okay, so now with that in mind, you've faced some major obstacles in your life and you've got quite a story, and you've used your story to teach a lot of people help a lot of people with breaking habits without willpower, which I think is a very interesting concept that you're helping people see it from a different angle. So can you talk about the obstacle that you went through and how this has helped you to do what you do today?
I had many obstacles, but the biggest, I had a lot of anxiety when I was younger, and now I see it as all the same thing. But at some point, my panic attacks, my anxiety, my constant worry, it took the shape of eating disorder. Like I said, now it all looks like just a different facet of thought. Basically, thought was showing up in one way that we call anxiety.
Yeah.
And then thought started showing up in another way. And I started trying to cope with it in a way that created this thing that we call an eating disorder. So after I was a psychologist, as I was working with people for 8 years, off and on, but mostly on, I battled with bulimia and binge eating. And, it was horrible in part because, dealing with those things are horrible, but mostly because I lived with this feeling of being a fraud, knowing I was helping the people I was working with to some extent, but then why couldn't I help myself? And, all of that. So,
a lot of conflict there. That's the trauma of you felt almost like, how can I sit and help you if I can't even help myself? But that in itself is very deep, isn't it? Just that experience alone.
It is, because we can help other people even when we can't help ourselves, because what I was sharing was true and I could see it in them, but you know what I mean? But it just didn't land when it came to me, which is really, you're right. That's really deep and really huge, because we're all exactly the same. Now I see more clearly. I still can't always see my own issues for myself so well, but now I deeply know that we're all the same. Mm-hmm. So anything that's true of one person has that potential to be true, or is true, deeply true of everyone. It's more about what we see or what we don't see in any given moment. So for me, for 8 years, I didn't see any of this as it related to me, but I could really truthfully sit in front of someone else and say, you're made of health, your experience is always changing. But it was just kind of words and cliche when it came to me. So I
for them, just wanted to ask you this, but when you saw it for them, it was so, you felt that so strongly that was the truth for them, and you felt a desire to convey that to them. Is that correct? Such a strong desire. So you could see it for them so clearly, but you couldn't see it for yourself. And I'm emphasizing that because that's such a common thing that people go through. And you're going to give us how you got a breakthrough, which is what I'm excited about.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting now, like just to kind of pull that out and look at it too. The fact that I could even see it so clearly for them, I did deeply know it. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
It has to be true for us. Anything we see for
Yes.
others has to be true for us as
Yes.
well. Yes.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So at the time, though, I didn't realize that. I didn't see it in any way that was helpful. So I would advise other people in a direction. I would see their health, but then I would just go to work on myself. And I mean, work. Like, the more diligent and the more discipline. And I was always, as I think many people do, just trying to manipulate, like pull the right lever so that everything would go away and so that I would feel better, like not realizing that it's so much deeper than that. But it was like, if I could just get my thinking right, my mantras and conscious thinking, if I could just have the right diet, if I could just have maybe it's my relationship, maybe it's unfulfillment over here. It was like that giant,
if only.
Oh my gosh. And the whole box of like psychology that says, oh, there are all these big hidden, things. You better find the right problem because it could be any of those lurking.
Oh, it's scary. It's almost scary when you say it like that. It's scary. Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah. And that's, I'm not saying anyone explicitly told me that, but that's the impression I got from my psychological training, from therapists I was going to, was like, wow, this is complex. It's deep, it's complicated, which is very scary because then you're like, man, I sure hope I get the right thing. Otherwise, I'm going to live with this forever.
Yeah, it feels hopeless. And you even say that in your book and I mean, I know this from my experience working as a clinician for 25 years as well. And just from my research, you get told an eating disorder is always going to be with you. You get told you get this thing, it's always who you are, but it's not. Anything that goes against, and I know you're very pro and we're going to talk about that, about our nature being, I call it wired for love. You talk about us being, I think your actual comment that you make, where do you make? You talk about, what do you actually say? You say there's no such thing as a mean or evil person. I mean, you say they are just people, always healthy, always pure, always full of love and connection at their core. I love that. That's what I've been saying for years. And it's like, wow, another person really gets that. And you come from that point of view, which is beautiful.
So before I saw that, though, it didn't look like that, right? No. It looked like, no, all these problems, you have to fix the right one in the right order and all of that. So I exhausted myself for 8 years, just doing everything. I mean everything from heavy therapy to energy work to anything you can imagine. And with each thing, and I see this, I'm sure you do as well with the people I work with, I love to work with people who have tried everything and nothing has worked, because I know what that feels like, where with each thing that you try that doesn't work, you get your hopes up. You pin it all on that outside thing as if it can save you, right? You think this will be the diet, this will be the therapist that'll save me, this will be the thing. And when it's not, you feel so much worse and more hopeless than before you even tried it.
So good.
Yes. And I don't love that people go through that, but I love finding those people that are feeling that way, because we get to tell them, no, it's not that you are broken. It's that all those things that you tried to have fix you cannot possibly fix you. It's really good news, when someone's feeling so defeated and you get to say to them, no, it's not you. It's all those methods. Those were never meant to fix you, because you don't need fixing the way you think you do.
I love that. That is so freeing. I just absolutely support 100% what you're saying and totally agree.
So I did all those things. Nothing worked. I felt more and more hopeless. And then I came across an understanding that was both scientific, and which I loved because I was all about the brain, and spiritual, which I have always been really open to, and really just kind of melded them together. So initially it was very brain-based, and it was some of the things I initially saw were things like some of the insights I had about the brain was, oh, my brain just demands food and then starving and then all the stuff my brain demands because it's a machine, and I've kind of taught it to do that. Not on purpose, but by my attention, by my behavior. I've just conditioned this poor little machine in my head to do exactly what it's doing. And that alone, that's just a brain insight, but that alone was huge for me, because what it did was it stopped me from thinking that my brain was broken, that there was something wrong. And it gave me so much compassion. And I got to see, wow, my brain does work. I've just been misunderstanding its messages and what it's doing.
That's fantastic. I listened to this with such joy in my heart because for 38 years, as I mentioned, I've been doing mind-brain research, showing people, and I've just done a clinical trial, just done another set this last year, just showing how much when you direct in neuroplasticity. I did some of the first work back in the 80s in neuroplasticity and traumatic brain injury and mental health over the years. They're always all different in that area. But just to it's so true what you're saying. We have this incredible power in our mind. We're not broken brains. We have this incredible depth in us, this tremendous wisdom. And when we use our mind, which is on different levels, to tap into the depths of our unconscious mind, we can actually change things. So it's not our destiny to get stuck with a broken brain. It's not an it that needs fixing. It's actually a mind that needs changing.
Yeah, and like Jeffrey Schwartz's work and some of that.
Yes, he's one of my friends, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. It was huge to see all that confirmation of, oh yeah, it's not even fixing or changing as much. I mean, it does change.
The brain changes,
by understanding, by by insightfully seeing, oh, this is just my mind doing what minds do. It's my brain doing what brains do sometimes, but seeing it from that new lens.
But seeing it that the mind change, you can use the mind to change the brain, which is so important, that the brain can change, but using your mind. But you've got mind on these different levels, which is so interesting. So keep telling us about the story.
Yeah, so that was one of the first big insights, and it was just more about the brain side of things. But it did so much, like I said, of helping me just have compassion and realize I wasn't as hopelessly broken as I thought I was. And then I came across more of the spiritual side of things, which totally just lined up with and made all the brain stuff make so much more sense, because I started to really deeply see, wow, I'm not my brain. I mean, of course, I knew I wasn't my brain, but I had more of a felt sense of that bigger mind that we all are. And it became less even, and still is, about me, even though I know that's what a brain and a mind is kind of conditioned to do, is make it all about us in a way. Yeah. But it was like, no, we're all one big mind. And when we see things, like we're saying, when we see with that bigger perspective, how machinery works, how our brain works, how all of this is playing out, and we know that we're not it. And we see that in any given moment, when all of our chatter kind of falls quiet, we're just full of everything we need. Wisdom, practical advice, like resourcefulness. We know not only like have the answers within us, but if, we know what to Google. I mean, we're like just, we can just be practical and live in the world in the highest possible way. When I kind of was able to back up and see that bigger spiritual essence beyond all the machinery, it all made sense put together, and it completely changed my life in many ways. But in terms of my eating disorder, it was amazing because I had tried everything for 8 years, had all these ups and downs, really extreme ups and downs. And in a really, really short period of time, I absolutely knew that I was going to be free of this. Now, my brain was still going there. You know what I mean? Like I still was thinking about food and thinking all this, but it was the most fascinating thing of like hearing that and seeing that and being able to say, oh, there goes my brain planning the next binge or planning the next purge, but I don't think I'm going to go there. I'm not going to do that. And, that separation, that ability to see our experience and not be in our experience was everything. So I still did act on those things a bit, but it was not long before it just made no more sense.
I just have to tell you that scientifically, the research clinical trial I've just done literally shows that that experience that you've had, it literally shows that on a mind, physiological and neurophysiological level. So I use QEEG in my neuroscientific research because it's very accurate for in the moment thinking. And it doesn't show thoughts, obviously, but it shows what the brain is doing in terms of the energy. But just there's a technique that I call the multiple perspective advantage, and you've just described it, that ability to separate, to stand back and observe your own thinking And then once you see that, you can actually then respond to the subconscious and the non-conscious mind. And what we picked up in the clinical trials is that non-conscious mind, the deeper stuff, the truth, the default mode that you also talk about. Let's talk about the default mode that I call wired for love. You talk about that we at our core decent, and there's this wisdom that when you stand back, you start hearing, you actually can start drawing out that wisdom, and you can separate out the toxic mindsets, the toxic thoughts in the unconscious from the conscious, and you can start actually working in that way. But you have to get to that point where you can separate the unconscious from the non-conscious, stand back and observe your own thinking. And that's and we saw that marrying when our subjects were doing that, we saw the changes happening in the brain, and you literally see the neuroplasticity, you see the changes. And then when they're speaking and describing the experience, there's still the anxiety, there's still the depression, but it's all part of a normal experience. It's now managed experience. So what you've just described, we've literally just confirmed scientifically once again in a very, very scientific way. It's actually real. This is real what you're saying. This is not something that it's not some woo-woo thing. What you've just described is a very, very real mind-brain thing that you've driven.
Oh my gosh. And what I love and what you just said too, and I see this with people I work with, is it's not about making something go away or stop. And that's what everybody thinks, of course.
Yes.
I thought, if I'm going to be free of this, these urges need to stop. They didn't stop, but I was still free of them.
You managed them. Yeah, that's it.
Yes. It's like to be able to watch it over here rather than here, and to know that it's experience.
It's not your broken brain. You don't have a broken brain. You're not you're not a robot with a broken piece that you just have to live with and then kind of control with the medication. You actually can stand back and observe that as an experience. I love how you said that. You can observe that as an experience, but you're not controlling it.
I always get the image of like people who have really large dogs and they take the dog for a walk with the dogs pulling them, like they're
yeah.
Like that's how I felt with my brain. I think that's how most people feel. Like whatever shows up, just got to do it. And to see that it isn't like that.
That's such a good analogy. And then you see that dog goes through training, and then that same person's now walking the dog, but that dog is now obeying them. Instead of them pulling them along, the dog is now being walked as opposed to the dog walking you. That's kind of the shift that's happened, where there's controlling. That's amazing. So how long did that take you? You were giving us a sort of time frame. You said that for the first few years of therapy, when you were giving therapy to people, you were actually practicing as a clinician, you were still battling with this. Then you had this insight when you started studying about the brain, and then pieces fell into place when you started seeing the spiritual side, because brain neuroreductionism, which is very much dominant in our society today and in the research since the mid-90s with the advent of technology, it all became about brain, and we forgot all about the spiritual. And this is an argument I've been making for years now and writing in my books and things, that you cannot focus on the brain and ignore the spiritual, which is the 99% part of us. The brain's just the 1%. And when you bring that blended connection together, it changes. Now that's the insight that you've had, and that's what shifted you to overcome your bulimia. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, and it happened really quickly. So yes, for 8 years of therapy and trying, but I want to say within a month of this insight, I was just free. And well before that, I knew I was free, like I had a few episodes, but even then I would have a binge and purge and think, why did I do that? I didn't have to do that,
It's more like just an old thing happening kind of thing.
An old reflex, but I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't holding on to it in the same way. So in many ways, it kind of went away instantly.
Wow. So that's almost like for about a month and then a few weeks before. So you're looking at a kind of like, and the reason I'm asking you this is because I showed in my research that on neuroplasticity cycles work in groups of 3. So we saw massive changes in the brain at day 21 and sustainable changes at day 63. So habit formation happens at day 63, which is 9 weeks. So you're kind of describing that same sort of arc.
Yes. Wow. That's giving me a lot of insights about the people I work with as well. And what I see.
Like the time frames. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
I do. Because it's like people see something brand new. Like I just call that insight, right? Like they just have like a deep insight. Their mind can't quite make sense of it yet, but they know something's shifted. But then, yes, it's weeks into, then there's like a readjustment period, right? And then it kind of becomes stable. Yeah.
And I love what you said earlier on about the fact that you have this thing that you've got to, that's the message of the current biomedical model, that it's got to go away. It's got to be eliminated with a drug. You've got to get rid of the symptom, like you have to get rid of the symptom of diabetes, the symptom of that relate to the disease of diabetes or heart. So they've lumped in the biomedical model with mind, but that's not the way mind works. It's not that you want to stamp out, because that's part of your story. It's part of your experience. You said that so beautifully. But you're not controlled by it anymore, but it was part of your story. It's become your story, but that you've overcome, and it's enriched you as a person. It's such a different philosophy to trying to stamp something out with a technique, the cognitive behavior therapy technique or something, that just condition it away, because you're not a robot. You've got this deep spiritual part of you.
Yeah. And I always say, that's real freedom. Yes. When we're able to feel anything, like I can have an overwhelming urge to binge eat now. I haven't in years, but if one showed up, I'd be okay with it. It's experience, it's like, we don't have to walk around in fear of a feeling or a thought or any of that. That's freedom.
That's amazing what you've just said. And what do you think is the biggest contribution to that freedom that you feel? So if you've got the urge to binge and purge, now you don't feel fear. Why is that?
Because I deeply see it as moving, changing, fleeting experience. I know I don't have to do anything about it. I know it's going to maybe show up and go away. Like I know it doesn't mean anything about me. And that's a huge thing, especially with habits and addictions. When these thoughts and feelings come back, as they sometimes do, people think, oh, maybe I'm not recovered, or
that's the narrative. I love what you said. That narrative is amazing, because the narrative today is, if it comes back, you're still sick, or the sickness is coming back, and then it's defined as a sickness. You have an illness. Meanwhile, you've described it as a habit that is, and I want to talk about habits now, how you define them, because I love how you define them. You're saying that when it comes back, it doesn't control you. It's just a fleeting experience. It's not the illness coming back. It's just your experience. It's a memory. You did this in the past, but you've controlled it. So it's just a little fleeting memory. It's not an illness coming back. And I'm emphasizing that, because the message of today's narrative, as you know, is if people re-experience anything, that is the illness coming back. You need more medication. You need another course of some externalized thing that you said that too. People are getting all this external 24 different therapies. They're thinking if they go and get something outside and bring it in, it's going to fix them, but it's from the inside out.
Yes. That's the thing about not fearing it. It's like, well, why would I fear it? I don't think it means anything. I don't think it means here's the illness back and all of that. So that I see that with
so good.
Well, I mean, when that switch, when we have that flip, when it doesn't mean anything that something shows up in our experience, and
that's so good. That is really good. Okay, now you wrote this book a few years ago, the Little Book of Change. Big. I love that. And you go into this in a lot of depth about the things you've just been discussing and the spiritual side and that, and you define habits. So can you there's so much talk about habits, and there's so many ways of defining it. And everyone knows you've got to make little changes to get the big change. And it's kind of almost over talked about, but I like your angle, and I think it's very freeing. So can you define habits and how you see them, and maybe link that back to your example of the eating disorder, how you saw that as a habit, because it's a totally different way of looking at eating disorders.
Yeah, so I think what makes it feel like a habit is when we identify with and kind of own our experience as if it is us, the disease, the habit, when we have that umbrella, like label, diagnosis thing that looks so real and solid around it. I mean, we know, like, our brain is habitual, and thank God, like, it keeps us alive that way.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, so absolutely.
Stuff shows up in repetitive, habitual ways, especially stuff that we pay a lot of attention to, that gets all that punching, gets all those chemicals going. So, of course, our experience to some extent is going to be habitual. But I think where it turns into a habit, or especially like a bad habit that someone feels like they need to break, is when that experience is showing up. And just like you just said, we pounce on it in a way and think, oh no, here's my habit. Oh, there's that feeling again. Oh, here it is. So it's all the narrative, 100%. The experience is habitual. We all have a million habits in terms of our experience. But it's only a bad habit that hurts us and limits our life when we have that narrative that thinks it's meaningful and that we need to now fix it and change it.
Okay, so how do we deal with that then? How do we change that narrative?
I think we just see that there's a narrative, honestly, from that bigger mind place. I think we just see there's a narrative. And what if there's a narrative saying it's a thing and it's solid and it's meaningful, but what if it isn't? What if there's, without a mind that's coming in, labeling everything and on this linear path and telling us what's ours and what's not, there's just experience showing up moment by moment by moment, new, constant, old, habitual, whatever, but it's just experience moment to moment. And I know, like, from my experience with my habits, again, when I came in and said, oh, this means something, it's back, here it is, that just is what I felt and it's what I acted on. But if it starts to look a little more like just experience, always in motion, always flowing through us, always in flux, and we're clinging to it less, and we're not sticking it in the ground, putting labels on it, letting it be there and move through us, it does move through us. And I'll pause in a second, but even bigger than that, as it moves through us, what I think is the most important thing about that is, as experience moves through us and we're not in there grabbing it and owning it, we get to feel into something far bigger, which is our spiritual essence, which is who we really are, which is, like we said, those insights where you're watching experience take place, but you're not worried about it and not needing to change it.
That's fantastic. Okay, so now let's relate that in almost a practical way. That's how you, within that month period or that few week period, month to maybe 7 weeks or so, you've managed to actually get set free from the bulimia, which 8 years and 24 therapies or whatever later, you hadn't done anything except maybe reinforce that there's something wrong with you and that why don't these things work, which put you in a really bad place. And then you got this insight and there was a shift. So then was it almost overnight that you stopped the bulimia? What did that look like?
It looked different overnight, but again, the behavioral pieces and all of that, just a little bit to catch up and to catch on, and but it was very, very quick, where it just looked different, where I saw it as experience that didn't mean so much about me.
Okay, so you distinguish between mental habits and behavioral habits, which is really good. It's the first time I've really seen people make that such a clear distinction. So in terms of what you also said in your experience, now mentally there was a shift. So your mental habits started managed to separate and realize it's an experience. And then you still had to use that experience to change the behavior. So the behavior was kind of lagging a little bit behind. Because I'm thinking of the listeners now, they're thinking, okay, but did you still binge and purge? And how long did that stop? And so if you can make that distinction.
I think it's a huge point, because the thing is, even though I did still binge and purge a couple times after my insight, it honestly didn't matter. There was nothing in that like my mind knew that it wasn't me, that it was just this behavioral thing kind of still playing itself out, but was going to be gone soon. I don't know how I knew that. I deeply knew that. I just saw, I don't have to do this anymore. So, and I think that is so big, because again, like we said, when a thought comes back, or for sure when a behavior comes back, when someone falls off the wagon, they're like, oh, see, I knew it. I knew I couldn't be free. I knew it couldn't be this easy.
And that chains them back in. They go right back to the beginning. No, you don't have to say that.
But not at all. I mean, the metaphor I used for this, I love this. I didn't come up with it, but I heard this somewhere. Like, if you imagine you live in a house for 20 years and then you move across town and you're leaving work and you got a lot on your mind and you're busy, no question, like, it's probably pretty likely that you might just mindlessly drive back to your old house in that first week, right? Like, no, you don't sit in the driveway and say, oh, I came to I guess I'm meant to live here forever. I should have never moved. This is my house. Like, no, you just laugh at yourself.
Exactly.
You see that, oh, I know where I live, but my body, just drove me here, and it's no big deal. And why wouldn't our habits and addictions be the same way? We have so much just that happens through us, just mechanically, those mechanical habits get to be so strong. But I think it's just the most normal thing in the world that we kind of fall back and and go back to old stuff. But if that looks like it means something, we're going to be in trouble. If it doesn't, we're not. And in fact, I think it's almost beneficial sometimes. I see when people have a slip up, they learn from it. They're like, oh yeah, I don't do this anymore. It could take them even further ahead, to even more insight. So
That's brilliant. It's a complete reconceptualization of the concept. And part of the principles that I teach in my work is you've got to embrace, process, and reconceptualize. And what you've just done is you've completely reconceptualized the whole concept of if people fall back into those toxic habits, whatever they are, it's an experience and not to be fearful of them, because it's the fear and that'll keep them stuck. From a scientific perspective, thoughts, the mind moves through the brain, and you know this very well, and then the brain responds. And then we know, I've done memory research for years as well, so how thoughts actually physically build in the brain. So then you get a physical protein structure, genetically things happen. So as you're thinking, you cause genetic expression, and you build these little thoughts into the tubulin, as in the little microcomputers, as vibration. It's real. They're a real thought, but they've got to stay alive with energy. So if they come back, it's like watering a plant. They have to be watered. So if you come back and you see that as a terrible thing, and you put all that energy onto this is back and I'm bad, it's the illness coming back, or I haven't conquered it and I'm stuck again and I'm going back to ground zero and whatever. You then shift all the energy from the reconceptualized, I've overcome and I've got a new way of functioning, back to this old thing, and you regrow something that actually was dead. But it's just got it's still part of your experience, so it's still there. So we see in the brain, you actually, and we saw this with this research, that when you shift your energy is never lost. So to keep those thoughts alive, they require energy. It's a vibrational energy within physical protein structures called tubulin. And when you stop thinking about it, or not thinking, when you manage it, stop thinking, always thinking, when you manage it in the way that you've beautifully described, you actually remove the energy from it so that it doesn't have, it's not strong anymore. It's just a little weak. It's just part of your experiential, goes into the experiential thing, and you've transferred the energy to the new way of functioning. So when it does come back, it's because, as you keep saying, it's part of your experience. So you're just having a glance and a little re-experience, but it doesn't own you. It's such a different picture to having, with the current narrative, is that this is a pattern. It's fixed in your brain. You can't change it. It has to be eliminated. And if it isn't eliminated, it means you're still sick, and it's back again, and this big violent. It's not. It's just a little thing that got a bit of energy, and you can take that energy back and put it in the right direction, because no energy in it won't control. So there's a shift, and we saw that actually happening in people's experience over time.
It makes so much sense. I love hearing, because I know everything you're saying is the case, but I don't study the science that much. But I love just knowing that, yes, it just makes so much sense, and there's physical scientific evidence for all of it.
Exactly, but you say it so beautifully, and you've experienced it in your own life. And I think as people are listening, you're freeing people, because it's those habits. Because most people, I don't know if you're from your experience, from my experience, people say, but it keeps coming back, and there's such a fear around that re-experience, and the narrative of once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, once an addict. I hate that. It's so unscientific and so untrue, because then all your attention is around, I've got to keep fighting. So there's that constant stress that your body's under and your mind is under.
And that's the thing about willpower, right?
Yes, talk about that.
Yeah, willpower can be great at times when we need it for little bursts. But when people try to break habits or end addictions or something like that with willpower, it's doing exactly what you're saying. It's keeping the energy on the thinking there. It wants to fall away. The energy wants to shift. Exactly. But it's us purposely bringing the energy back and saying, don't think that, think this instead, or don't do that, do this instead. And it just has that feeling, of just energizing what naturally just wants to fall away and shift. So
exactly.
It's so ironic, that it makes sense given what we think about how change works, and what, like you said, it's always about extinguishing and making this go away. It's our powerful way of trying to make change happen. But when we just look at it in a bigger sense of all of this energy is just always in motion, it's not wrong. It's just doing what it needs to do. And we can remove even the willpower and all of that. Oh my gosh, everything gets so much easier.
It's so different. And so you're constantly updating your experience. And in quantum physics, which is an area that I also work in to explain my work, is they talk about it, you're constantly updating. As the observer, so every experience is an update on the previous experience. So when you said learn from, when you tell your patients to learn from that, or anyone who's listening, if you fall back, you're learning from that, but you're updating, and your update is that you don't need to give it energy. You need to give the new reconceptualized thought, let that have all the energy. That's just part of your story that you've overcome. It's a whole different updating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I love how you explained about the willpower. It's because it's forceful, isn't it? The willpower's energy consuming. So instead of one going and becoming just energy. You've got two very strong competing, I mustn't do this, I mustn't do this, I must do this, I must do this, is very stressful. We see that creates a lot of high beta in the brain and learning in the brain, and you're learning the wrong thing. You actually just reinforce.
And it's very ironic that people try to use willpower at their weakest moment, because it does take so much energy, right? So it's like in the middle of an urge to binge eat or drink or whatever people do, they're supposed to now come in and overpower that urge that's already depleting them, that's already taking so much energy,
Wow.
So like that piece as well. It was just like, wow, this doesn't make any sense. Not only is willpower not a good long-term strategy, but we can't even use it when we have no resources. That's the last time it's going to be helpful.
Yeah, so talk a bit more about that. Talk about then what should people do in that moment, in that moment where we've been so conditioned by the therapies and the cognitive behavior therapy and the narrative, neuroreductionistic narrative and the happiness movement, willpower. What is the alternative narrative?
For me, it's tough to do much in the moment, because in the moment, again, is when our mind, like everything is just busy and cloudy and we aren't seeing straight. We are a little hijacked by our thinking.
Exactly.
We're not seeing straight.
Exactly.
So when people ask, and they do all the time, of course, because that's how we've been kind of trained, is like, what do you do in the moment to make it go away? For me, it's like, I don't know. I don't want to give you a job to do in that moment. Of all moments, I'm not going to give you a job to do that's going to take up more energy that you're supposed to remember this thing.
Oh, gosh. So what a great idea. Yeah. I mean, great way explaining it.
Yeah. So it looks more to me, and again, I would love to hear what you think about this, but it looks more to me like it's the insights beforehand. It's the exploration of this, like seeing, because I know when I saw like, oh, it's all experience. It's all going to move through me. That energy is always going to fluctuate. I never have to step in and make energy fluctuate. I don't know how to do that. It just does it by nature.
Yeah.
Then it just allowed me to just feel more, just to kind of let go even more. So it became about like non-interference more than stepping in and doing something. And also this piece about, which is so backwards from how we have it in life, that the worse I feel, the more that's inviting me to just take my hands off the wheel and just let everything kind of move through and reset. And that's, what do we do in life? When we feel bad, we humans in any way, step in and do something. We're going to fix this. So we're going to find the outside cause of our feeling bad, and we're going to change it. And it doesn't work that way.
No.
All we're feeling is our own experience, and it's going to change anyway. So it's a long answer, but the in the moment thing, I always think it's not an in the moment strategy. It's a bigger understanding. And as people wake up to this bigger truth about how we work and how it all changes, they just ask that in the moment question less and less, because they feel bad and they know that everything's going to move through.
You've said it so beautifully, and on a scientific level, something I used to, this is some of the techniques, let's get away from the word techniques, processes. When you embrace something, which is what you're saying, embrace the moment. And when you even celebrate that moment, I always tell people, celebrate what you're feeling, even if it's terrible, because the minute you celebrate something, you're not celebrating the issue, you're celebrating the fact that you're aware of it. And awareness weakens something. So as soon as you are aware, so the neuroscience shows that as soon as you're aware of a thought, as soon as it's moved from the non-conscious, which is different to the unconscious. I teach on the non-conscious mind, subconscious, and conscious mind. The unconscious mind is when you have an anesthetic or you knocked out with a baseball. That's a whole different, but the non-conscious mind is the deep stuff you're talking about, that spiritual part of us where the wisdom resides, where our truth is, where we can get access to the global mind, which can call, as you say, I talk about godness, or you can talk about whatever, non-physical, whatever name you call it, there's wisdom out there. Quantum physicists have shown mathematically that we immersed in gravitational fields, and those have the values of love and joy and peace and all that good stuff. And we have access to that wisdom. It's in us. And when we get into that calm down moment, even if you feel like you're freaking out, I talk about freaking out in the love zone. Even when you're in that freaking out moment, you can freak out in the love zone, which means you can allow it to come up, cry the tears, express it, as you keep saying so beautifully, experience that. And that allows your brain a chance to actually adjust the energy levels, adjust the chemicals. And in that, especially the first 30 to 90 seconds, you're not clear in any kind of wisdom. So you should not make any decisions or react if you possibly can. Obviously, if you're driving a car, it's a different story. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about those emotional things. So it's to definitely allow yourself to go through that process where your brain and energy calms down. And then you can start accessing the wisdom of the unconscious mind. So we saw in our neuroscientific studies that when you get into that, when you allow this celebration, this embracing stuff, this process, before you even process, you actually allow the alpha bridge to increase. When alpha increases, the energy that your brain is giving off, you can access the deep spiritual wisdom. But if it doesn't, you don't get access to that insight that you talk about. So you use the word insight. You won't get access to it when your mind is all chaotic and crazy. So, but you can have a chaotic and crazy mind that is in the love zone, and you can get access to that wisdom. I can be crying, screaming, whatever. But there's a level of insight I'm digging. I'm starting to get to the point where I can start knowing what the next move is. And that's very freeing. I think that's what you're talking about.
Totally. And I love, it sounds so paradoxical. People say,
it does.
And we talk about it as I talk about it as like you're either in your head or you're in the bigger wisdom, but it's not either or. I mean, sometimes it is. You're so in your head, like you said, you can't access anything. But I love when we get to move into that space where it's both. We can be feeling anything.
Yeah.
Like you said, screaming, crying. I mean, how often have I yelled at my husband and in the back of my mind thinking, why am I picking a fight with him right now?
Exactly.
Yes. It's both. They're both there. It's amazing.
Yeah, we can be in both those states at the same time, which is incredible. Well, you also talk about what are some of the most common, I've got some questions up here I want to ask you, specific ones related to what we're talking about. What are some of the most common traps or mistakes that people fall into in trying to change a bad habit or build a new habit?
I think one of the most fun, for sure, everything we're saying, which is experience comes through and they try to push it away, will it away, numb it away. Like what that all comes down to is just being afraid of our experience, not understanding that experience is safe and it's going to just move right through us. So any way that we jump in and step in, and also part of that is, a huge early conversation that I think is so helpful is seeing that these problems and issues, yes, they create problems and issues in our lives for sure, and in our health and all of that. But in and of themselves, it's kind of what I saw. I kind of taught my brain to do this innocently. I didn't mean to. I didn't do it on purpose, but we're still okay. We're not broken. We just need to understand what's going on and how we're working rather than say, no, this is a problem and this must stop.
I love that. That's so incredible. We see from the research that I've done that when your non-conscious mind is active 24/7, it's really fast. It's your spiritual, non-physical. You talk about the non-physical, the spiritual. This is what I'm talking about. We'll pick up on the QEEG, the truth of what you're feeling before your conscious mind is aware of it. So there's your truth. It's very often, because we kid ourselves, we say things that I've got to do this. But deep down inside, you actually know, and you said that earlier on, you know that, okay, listen, just relax a bit with this, just accept this view, it's not that bad, or whatever it is, but the truth is there. But we have this almost conflict between what we're consciously telling ourselves and what we know to be truth. And that's always trying to teach people with the work I do, is you've got to get into that state where you can actually hear the truth that's inside of you, and then you can deal with those, which I think is exactly what you're saying.
Even just knowing that there's a truth that's always there and that's wiser and that we can trust. And then our mind is like a step behind. It's lagging behind.
Yes.
It interprets and gives explanations.
Conscious, yeah.
And the research on we make choices, and then our mind comes in milliseconds later and says, oh, I chose this because, which is ridiculous. We were choosing it before. It was already,
the intelligence is already happening before you're consciously aware. So you're consciously aware, the intelligence is already happening. And that's why we need to have that insight.
Amazing. And just knowing that works, I think is just so hopeful and helpful for people, because it starts to take our emphasis off all the stuff our mind is saying all the time. Mm-hmm. Not that we need to ignore that or anything, but
it's insightful.
Yeah, we don't want to hang on it as if everything that comes through our mind is the truth. And so it starts to shine, put a little suspicion on it, which is super helpful.
That's very good. Put a little suspicion. Question what your conscious mind is telling you. That's what you're saying. Am I correct? Yeah, I agree totally with that. Now, okay, so how can a friend or a parent or a partner help someone who's trying to change? How can you help someone?
The more us as friends and parents and partners can see the health in them, the more it's hard sometimes. You have a family member with an addiction. Of course, you see the destruction and the suffering and the pain, but the more that we can see the health, even when we can't see the health. So it's bigger. It's about knowing what's true of all humans, and that this person is only drinking or eating or whatever they're doing because they're hurting. And in their brain, it's the best way they can see to numb that feeling, because they're afraid of their experience and they don't want to feel it. It's never because they're wrong or they want to be doing this that kills me, or that, you're self-sabotaging, or why are you ruining your family? They're doing it because they're hurting and they don't see a better way.
That's really good. Talk about that a little bit more, because you talk about how a habit starts off to deal with the pain. And I mean, I totally agree with that. That's how I see addiction. I don't see addiction as a toxic thing, because addiction means to be consumed by. So we're designed to be consumed by healthy stuff. So when things aren't quite right, we develop these behavior patterns to help us cope. Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, which even the fact that we develop these behavior patterns to help us cope speaks to our health. Because when we don't feel well, we know that's not okay. We know that's not us. We don't want to hang out in not feeling well. We will do anything we can to get closer to home, to feel more like ourselves. And do we find things that are unhealthy and then become addicted or consumed in them? Absolutely. But, it all is coming from our desire to just feel closer to home and to feel better. So, and I think that's just so important for people to see, because, this so quickly, like you were saying, the societal narratives about all this just make it our fault, whether they say that explicitly or not. They blame the person who's in the addiction, and it's just.
So to pick up on helping with this philosophy, if you approach a person with what you and I've just both said now, then how can you help the person without enabling them? What do you do? What can you be a bit more? Can you be specific around maybe just a technique or two, or not a technique? I see you don't like words like techniques like me. What can you do for that family member?
For me, it's all about exploring who we really are and how our experience works. It's just a series of conversations and exploration. And hey, I know it looks like you're broken. I know this looks like a problem we have to do something to solve. But what if? What if it actually is happening this way? What if everything in you is super healthy, but you feel something, and there's some experience moving through you that you just don't feel like you can handle? What's that about? Like, what if all experience is safe? What if all experience moves through? And that's just what I've seen, is like just having these kind of deep conversations when people are willing to set aside and it's hard, like for people to change their mind and open their mind. It is not easy. I respect it so much when people do it, but for them to set aside everything they've been told and taught and look in a different direction and say, what if you're healthy and your experience is not what it appears to be? And people start to have insights, and it starts to build.
So would that be a question that one could prompt that kind of discussion with, and then just listen and let the person talk?
Yeah, because, people are so wise. Like you said, and
they are.
Relaxed they are, the more all that wisdom just comes out. So I think people know for sure, we know way more than we think we know about what we need and what's true of us.
That's so brilliant. That's so helpful, hopeful, and utterly brilliant. And I'm thrilled that you've said what you've said, because I think it's tremendously freeing, and it takes all that scary work, and it's so hard and it's never going to be achievable. You're taking it away and you're saying, okay, let's just experience. What if that is an experience? What is it telling you? Let's just talk about it. It's flowing through you. It's what you're going through at the moment. So have I understood you correctly? Is that the correct?
And it never looks like enough. Again, I just feel like we're so conditioned to what are the steps? What's the tool? What's the technique? How is this going to work? And, you from a scientific perspective could say exactly how this works. All I know is, really from a very practical,
that's really good though.
Intuitive perspective is, hey, I can tell you when I talk with people, I've talked with thousands of them, and we explore this and we look at what if it actually works this way. They have insights, tons of them along the way. And those just keep getting deeper and deeper for them. I think we're so much closer to health than we even think we are.
Wow.
It doesn't take much.
That is beautiful. We're so much closer to health than we actually realize that we are. And we've put almost like roadblocks that you got to go through, all these hoops, all these hurdles to get to. Meanwhile, just don't see those hurdles, just experience, go with the flow. So what is this experience telling you? What if this is just an experience that you're going through. That's amazing. Oh, I love it. I love this. I totally agree with you. This is how I understand the mind to work. So I am all for what you said. It's so hopeful. There's so much hope that we can. I think we've made things so much harder than what they are and what they should be. And it doesn't mean that we're not saying life's a walk in the park. It's terribly difficult. But we've made the getting through life so much harder, I think, than what we could. There's so much truth inside of ourselves and wisdom.
And so much more complicated than it is. I mean, there's so much complexity in biology and in the world and all the form, all the physicalness is so complex in an amazing way. But we as part of nature, as like this bigger essence, we're super simple. It's just so simple. And it's hard for us to see it that way, but it's so simple.
Simple and brilliant. It's almost like the day that we started needing nutritionists to tell us how to eat is the day that we really messed up food. It's the most logical, natural thing to eat healthy food if we actually go back to basics. Same thing with our mind. It's there. But sometimes we just need, we need each other just to maybe prompt us to experience these things more. This is beautiful. How can people get hold of you and know more about you? And we'll obviously put all these links in the show notes.
Yeah, my website is dramyjohnson.com. It's just Dr. Amy Johnson. And there's lots of stuff there. I have a podcast. I have an online school where I walk people through this to help them with habits. Yeah, so there's lots of stuff there.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really lovely, deep, exciting conversation. And I really thank you for your insight and your wisdom.
Thank you so much. I love talking with you.
I love it too. We'll have to do this again, for sure.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much.